Hello, a very warm good morning to all of you and welcome to Unacademy. Welcome to today's The Hindu newspaper analysis, where we take a look at the international edition of today's The Hindu newspaper. Take a look at the various different articles relevant for your prelims as well as the mains examination, and also take a look at the practice questions to help you understand the nuances of answer writing. So let us take a look at the topics that we are going to have a discussion for today. So today in total we are going to have a discussion for 9 different topics. Out of that, 2 of them belong to the same particular context. So here, Supreme Court overrules the 1967 verdict on AMU Aligarh Muslim University minority tag. So that is where a 7-judge bench has issued a judgment overturning its previous judgment of 1967. So this is going to be relevant for your GS paper 2. Now, another news story which has been doing a lot of rounds since yesterday has been the fact that one of the dissenting judges, Justice Datta, has actually said that the bench didn't discuss the AMU case enough owing to the paucity of time. And that is where the deliberation which is required by the judges, that oftentimes gets sidelined. So that also raises an important aspect associated with the huge amount of work pressure and the workload that the judges have to take care of. So this is a kind of an addendum we will be discussing along with the same topic, also relevant for your GS paper 2. Then the BRICS Journey, the relevance of the BRICS Journey and the Kazan Summit for India, and the aspect that new entries are coming in, partner states have been created. So this is again relevant for your GS2. Then, owing to the fact that Conference of Parties 29 is going to be held from November 11th. So as is the trend, today also you have one of the topics associated with climate, but today it is a topic associated with the cooling aspect. So staying cool but with clean tech and global collaboration. This is relevant for your GS paper 3. Then the Musi's cleanup. This is about the cleanup of river Musi, and this is one of the environmental or the urban issues that majority of the developing world faces, and more so in India we face that. We see that with Yamuna, we see that with Kuam, we see that with Musi. So that is where we have to understand this, and questions can be asked from GS paper 1 or GS paper 3. Then few of the topics relevant for your prelims: satellite collars to track elephants after the death which have occurred, the elephant deaths which have occurred in the region of Bandhavgarh. Now there the deaths have occurred because of the consumption of kodo millet. So that also we will take a brief overview at what is that kodo millet. Then CJI completes the last working day, set to retire, and the new Chief Justice is going to be sworn in. Zomato, Swiggy have been found to be breaching antitrust laws, and tea industry calls for scientific quality grading. What will be the impact of that? These are the topics that we are going to have a discussion for today. But before we jump into the discussion straight ahead, many of you who are actively thinking of pursuing a career for civil services and wanting to have a preparation might have a hesitation in terms of where to go. Maybe the resource required is very high, and thereby there is an incapability and incapacity to delve that much amount of resource into preparation once again. So that is where Unacademy brings for you UCSC, that will be held tomorrow, 10th of November, right? 11 a.m. and 5 p.m. So this is going to be a test, a championship test where you stand a chance to win a lot of various different prizes, and at the same time you get to know your locus standi amongst your peer group and amongst the other aspirants. So do take the test and do watch the live discussion which will be held on YouTube. Now, having said that, let us take a look at the first topic of the day, the first article, that is Supreme Court overrules the 1967 verdict on AMU's minority tag. Now, just to give you a kind of a pre-context, or first of all, what is the background of it? So we will declutter this entire topic into various parts. First of all, I understand, and it is absolutely okay to know or not be knowing about what is the background of it. So what is the background of the 1967 verdict? What did Supreme Court observe at that point of time? Then what happened thereby? Where did Allahabad High Court come in? And what did the petitioners challenge in 2019 in front of the Supreme Court, due to which the 7-judge constitutional bench of the Supreme Court issued a 4:3 majority judgment talking about that the 1967 order has been overturned, right? Having said that, AMU, whether it is a minority institution or not, that will be decided by another bench. So that is a different matter. But let us declutter this topic as much as we can, and let us try to understand it in the simplest of the terms. So first of all, what is the context of this entire case? Where did this issue arise from? So basically, in 1967, you had the Constitution bench, 5-judge bench at that point of time. This was a 5-judge bench, right, in 1967. So the 5-judge bench issued a judgment, in S. Aziz Basha versus Union of India. Now, in that case, the court's judgment was basically that AMU is not a minority institution. Aligarh Muslim University is not a minority institution. Now, regarding minority institutions, the article of the Constitution which covers the provision associated with minority institutions is Article 30, and that too particularly Part 1 of Article 30, which gives the rights to the minorities, be it religious, linguistic, any kind of minorities, to be able to administer and run their own institutions. Right. Now, the Supreme Court 5-judge bench in 1967 had held that AMU is not a minority institution, and to enjoy that status, it should have been both established and administered by the minority. So, at that point of time in 1967, the Supreme Court had said, and notice this very carefully, Supreme Court had said that for any institution to be recognized as a minority institution, it should be established by the minorities themselves, and the administration should also be there by the minorities themselves. In AMU, that was something which was not the case. So that is where AMU was not regarded and will not be regarded as minority institution, was the judgment. Now, that is where the Parliament made a law, and that was the Parliament made a legislation, the AMU Act, in 1981. 1981, the Parliament formed a law for AMU, right? And that provided it with the identification as a minority institution, just in order to countervent this Supreme Court judgment institution. Now, this was a law passed by Parliament. Now, in 2006, based upon a petition which was filed in Allahabad High Court, in 2006, Allahabad High Court overturned or quashed this law. It said that AMU cannot be identified as a minority institution based upon these two criteria: established by the minority completely and administered by the minority itself. So that is when the Allahabad High Court had quashed the idea. Allahabad High Court. Right? It had basically quashed the law. Now, in 2019, petitioners approached the doorsteps of the Supreme Court and they said that, look, if by this criteria you are cancelling the recognition of institutions as minority institutions just because they are not completely being administered by the minorities, then that would impact a lot of other prestigious institutions as well. For example, St. Stephen's in Delhi. For example, CMC, Christian Medical College in Vellore. All of them would lose their minority status tags. And that is something which will have a wide-scale ramification as well. So this was the question point in front of the Supreme Court bench. Supreme Court formed a 7-judge bench, constitutional bench, to understand and to actually take a look at it, whether that 1967 order, whether that is okay or not. So the judgment that has been issued by the Supreme Court is only based upon that 1967 ruling. Supreme Court has overturned it. It has overturned it on the basis that Article 30 Part 1 of the Constitution should not be read in a very narrow mindset. You should have a broader outlook of Article 30, and there should be 3 parameters based upon which you have to understand the reading and understanding of the Article 30 and thereby grant a particular institution a minority status or not. So what is this Article 30 Part 1 that we are talking about? So this can be relevant even for your prelims. So when we talk about Article 30, it deals with the rights of minorities to establish and administer educational institutions. And Part 1, all minorities, whether based on religion or language, shall have the right to establish and administer educational institutions of their choice. Now the Supreme Court said that you simply cannot take a very narrow view, because if you take a narrow view of this particular article, that means then you will have a precondition that no, it has to be established completely by the minorities also, administered completely by the minorities also. The education imparted should also be targeted towards the minorities only. But that will be a very narrow outlook. So what is it that the Supreme Court said? Supreme Court said that there are 3 indicators based upon which you can have a broader interpretation of Article 30. Which are those 3 indicators? The first is that who was the brain behind the establishment of an institution, right? If that person belonged to a minority community, let's suppose there are 4 people who tomorrow decide that we will set up an institution. But it cannot be the case that the genesis of idea came with all the 4 at the same time. One of them would have come up with the idea, or a couple of them would have come up with the idea. Now, if those 2 belong to the minority institution, one criteria is fulfilled. It need not be the case that all the 4 should be from minority communities only. The main brain behind the establishment, if they are from minority communities, first criteria is fulfilled. Then, what was the purpose of the establishment? And third, what were the steps taken to implement this purpose? Who provided the land? How was the land obtained? Where the funding was obtained? If the funding was provided by the minority community, the land was taken from the minority community, that also stands as a criteria. Now, what did the judgment talk about? Now coming to the judgment. So the judgment talked about the fact that an educational institution established by a minority community will not lose its identity once it is recognized through a statute of law. Statute means law, right? So it is not necessary that the educational institution must have been established only for the benefit of the religious or linguistic minority, right? So if I have established an institution, it is not necessary that the purpose is only for the minorities. Predominantly, minority communities have to be addressed and taken care of. But it is not a universal set that 100% of the purpose is only for minority communities. That will make the institution a non-inclusive kind, right? So it must predominantly be for its benefit. It is not necessary that education must be provided in the language spoken by the minority or in the religion of the minority. So that allows for some leeway for the institutions as well. But then there are the other indications, as I told you. There are 3 indications overall, right? Who was the brain? Where did, or what was the purpose? Where did the resources come from? So that is where information on who contributed the funds for its creation, who was responsible for obtaining the land, whether the land was donated by a member of the minority community or purchased from funds raised by minority community, or for this purpose, or donated by a person from some other community, that can be also a criteria to be identified as a minority institution. Okay. Now, what about the administration of the institute? Because the 1967 judgment had said that it has to be administered by the minority community itself. So there is where Supreme Court differs. The present judge and the 7-judge bench, they differed from the earlier 5-judge bench ruling. And they said it is not necessary to prove that administration vests with a minority to prove that it is a minority educational institution. Okay, because the very purpose of Article 30 Part 1 is to grant special rights on administration. That minority, people of minority community will have a special right in terms of administration. Does not mean that you set it as a precondition, right? So when people have a special right in an institution, that people from minority community can be an administrative member or can take an important role in the administration, that is a consequence of establishing a minority institution, isn't it? If tomorrow I establish a minority institution and thereby people from that religious minority, linguistic minority, they have to play a significant role in the administrative mechanism. Now, that will be for the benefit of the minority. So it is a consequence of establishing a minority institution. It cannot be a precondition, right? That unless and until all the members of the administration are from the minority community, no minority institution. That cannot be a precondition. To do otherwise would amount to converting the consequence to a precondition, was the statement issued by the Chief Justice. So that is where the Supreme Court has come and contravened the earlier judgment issued. Now, whether AMU in itself is a minority institution or not, that will be decided by a separate bench. But what did this judgment do? Overturned the earlier judgment regarding a blanket aspect of all the minority institutions. Understand, AMU had been established way back in 1875, right? But there are many such other minority institutions being operated and run throughout the country. I've given you the examples also. So 1967 judgment and the quashing of the 1981 Act by the Allahabad High Court would have wide-scale ramifications. So that is what the Supreme Court has overturned. Now the case specifics of Aligarh Muslim University, that will be decided by some other bench. So overall, what is the gist of the court order? So the view taken in the Aziz Basha that an educational institution is not established by minority if it derives its legal character through a statute is overturned. The question of whether AMU is a minority educational institution must be decided based upon the principles laid down by the judgment by another bench. Okay? So I hope this topic is clear. So again, moving you through the traces of this particular topic. First of all, what was the Aziz Basha judgment and its importance in terms of the minority institutions? Then 1981 Parliament Act, 2006 overturning and quashing of that act by the Allahabad High Court, 2019 the matter gets raised in the Supreme Court by the petitioners. Supreme Court in the judgment has overturned the 1967 ruling. As simple as that. Okay. Now, on what basis did Supreme Court overturn the judgment? On a broader reading of Article 30 rather than a narrow legislative language-based reading of Article 30. So that means on 3 criteria, on 3 indices, who was the brain, what was the purpose, and where did the resources come from, right? Not necessary that complete administration has to be by the minority community. Not necessary that the language of or the medium of communication has to be in the linguistic minority or the religious minority. Not necessary that the complete education is only for the minority. Predominantly should be serving minority. It is a minority institute. Okay. Now, moving on to the second topic. And before that, the associated aspect was also the fact that bench didn't discuss AMU case enough. Now, the dissenting judge, that is Dipankar Datta, you have in this particular judgment of AMU, you had the majority judgment 4:3. 3 judges dissented. Now, Dipankar Datta made a very interesting observation. He basically said that, look, I understand that there is always a paucity of time, but in this particular case, the reality of the matter also is that the judges did not get enough time to deliberate amongst themselves, exchange the ideas, and also understand each other's perspective. Justice Datta has said that when it comes to the issuance of the order, a draft order of the CJI was something which was circulated, and that was one of the bases, right, based upon which almost all the judges, whether in dissent or whether in agreement, they issued their judgments. But ideally, what generally happens is that the judges get to interact, they tend to understand, the larger perspective of the case is also understood by these judgments, brainstorming happens. But because the timeline was so stringent to issue an order, that is why basically the proper deliberation could not happen. That tells you the problem associated with the judges, the problem that they face with the huge pendency of the cases, right? That is where the judges are overworked, and that can sometimes end up impacting the quality of judgment, the objective nature of the judgment, and also the aspect of healthy democratic debate and dissent amongst the judges. Okay. Now, coming to the second article, the BRICS Journey, gaining heft while in transition. This is relevant for your GS paper 2 for the portion of your IR. Now, when we talk about BRICS, now BRICS was a terminology. Initially, it was BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. It was supposed to be a grouping of developing nations, emerging nations on the global scale, because emerging nations basically felt sidelined by the developed members of the world, and developed members of the world had own sort of grouping, so they always felt sidelined. So they started with BRIC, and then that later on expanded to BRICS. Now, since that point of time, the BRICS summit has been held. Leaders have continuously been meeting every year, and that has served as a common platform for various different agendas and various different purposes. Now, this year in the Kazan summit, which was held in Russia, now Kazan, the importance of Kazan, the rivers draining through Kazan, that will be relevant for your prelims. So that is where we have covered it along with the multiple choice question in the video of Places in News. Those of you who have not watched it, please take a look at it. Now, this Kazan summit basically also marked the first event where you had 5 new entrants of the into the BRICS, and Vladimir Putin, being the host, claimed now that BRICS is no longer a kind of a small group, but it is a majoritarian grouping consisting of a large portion of the globe. On what basis did he make that comment? So basically, 5 new members to BRICS other than Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. The 5 new members who have been admitted are Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and UAE. Out of that, Saudi Arabia is still a bit reluctant in order to go for a full-fledged joining. And that is owing to the US pressure. US doesn't like these kind of groupings like BRICS. And that is where the US political pressure is significantly high also. But if you take a look at the statistics in terms of the member nations who have joined BRICS, you will find that it is quite interesting in the case that when you talk about the population, the grouping ends up representing more than 40%, 45% of the global population, right? Majority of them contributed by India and China itself. So the population, that means almost or more than 40% of the global population is represented by these countries. Then when we talk about the GDP and exports, there also a significant portion of the global might is now a part of the BRICS. Now, when we say a part of the BRICS, the grouping of BRICS, BRICS works on 3 different verticals and 8 different core principles. Those core principles are required to be understood for your examination perspective. So what is the principles, that is what refers to the BRICS spirit? So that BRICS spirit needs to be upheld by the member nations. That is the overall aim. Now, it is a broader set of principles which can be a guiding light, a guiding pathway regarding what the countries and how the countries behave in terms of the global community of nations. So here, mutual respect and understanding, sovereign equality, solidarity, democratic ideals in democracy, openness, inclusiveness, collaboration, and consensus. Now, this is for when we say aspect of democracy. Does that reflect that the country should have democratic ideals within their own political system? No. It means the grouping should be democratic. It means that the grouping should have democratic values where all the members are okay to contribute, right? Their voices are heard. Their voices are not subdued based upon the economic heft of the other nations, etc. When we talk about solidarity, if there is a calamity that any of the nations face, the others should always have a solidarity approach. Sovereign equality, treat everyone as your equal. Nobody is higher or lower. Openness in terms of exchange of ideas, in terms of the future goals, perspectives. Inclusiveness in terms of any decision taken by BRICS should be beneficial for all of them, be it the financing mechanism or anything else. So that is inclusiveness, collaboration, and also consensus, not on a majoritarian aspect. Okay? Now, BRICS are governed by primarily three different verticals. What are the verticals for BRICS? One is political and security vertical, political and security. Second is economy and economic cooperation. And the third is cultural and people-to-people contact. People-to-people contact. These are the three verticals upon which you have decisions which are taken, upon which the progression in the summit that happens. Now, what was the outcome in the case of Kazan summit in each of these verticals? That needs to be understood. So when we talk about political and the security parameters, here the prime agenda which was talked about, even though momentarily so, was about the need for reform of UN. Including the Security Council structure, right? Because the countries agreed that there should be a representation by India in the Security Council, there should be a representation from Latin America and also from Africa in the Security Council. So that is where the reform agenda was put up. But obviously there was a kind of a cold wall or a kind of a stonewalling done by China, because China is not in the favor of expansion of the Security Council at all, particularly when it comes to admittance of another country like India. So that is where China feels a bit of a threat, so to say, even though it is much larger economy, much larger power as compared to India, but it does not want the neighboring nation to also have the same global stature, and that is the aspect of the Chinese growth. Now, the second agenda in the political and security was they condemned unilateral sanctions. Unilateral means that if, let's suppose, tomorrow UN decides to impose sanction on Russia, that is still okay and still understandable. But when it comes to tomorrow US deciding that this country will be sanctioned, that country won't be sanctioned, and XYZ country will be sanctioned, that is unilateralism. Now, that can never be for global good, and that can always lead to isolation and breakdown of global public trust. So this is where against unilateral sanctions. Now, because you had members like Iran, Saudi Arabia, all of them being a part of the new summit. So this particular Kazan summit had a very harsh wording when it came to Israel's action over Palestine and in the nearby region of Lebanon as well. So that is where the wordings talked about the atrocities committed by the Israeli Defense Forces. Now, Israel didn't take it kindly, and Israel retaliated, in fact, with an attack on Iran directly. So that is where condemning Israel's actions against Israel's action. But at the same time, you have to keep in mind that there was another and there is another global conflict which is still unfolding, which is still happening, and that is the Russia-Ukraine war. So that Russia-Ukraine war, there, obviously Russia being the host, you cannot have the strong wording. So there you had a very watered down approach about the Russia-Ukraine war. Then about the economic cooperation. Now, Saudi Arabia being a new entrant, so that had set an expectation that there will be huge amount of capital infusion in terms of the finance mechanisms. But Saudi Arabia is still weighing its options, and obviously Iran also being the part of the same grouping, Saudi Arabia is not that comfortable being part of that grouping, so it has not promised any major capital infusion. So the capital infusion in terms of the BRICS Bank, in terms of its future aspect of lending, etc., that was something which was not agreed upon. But then there was a further build-up in terms of the already agreed aspect of mutual beneficial relationship, mutually beneficial in terms of trade in domestic currencies, right? So amongst the BRIC nations, so trade in BRICS nations or amongst the BRICS nations in local currencies. Now you have to understand that this represents a very large economic power. We have talked about in terms of economic might, this ends up representing more than 1/3 or almost close to more than 1/4 rather, more than 25% of the global economy is in this grouping. And with around 34 new members ready to be a part of the grouping, this will always take this figure closer to 1/3 of the global economy. If 1/3 of the global economy starts trading in the local currency, what will happen? The trade cost will go down. And also the overall reliance that people put in terms of dollar, that you have to trade in hard currency, be it dollar, be it pound sterling, etc. So that dollar hegemony, as has been the question which has been asked, so that will go down. So that over-reliance on dollar is what makes US such a global power. And various countries have identified that and have been knowing this, that the sooner we shift away from dollar, we are free from the aspect of US influence and the US overhang. So that is why the BRICS nations, for them to be trading in local currencies, that will be promoted further. Now, people to people contact and connect, that was to be encouraged, and that has been encouraged, and cultural interactions and various different groups moving from one of the BRICS nations to the other for cultural aspects, that has also been given an in principle encouragement. But also in the final moments of the summit, Vladimir Putin had basically issued a statement where he said that there are 34 other nations who are keen to join the BRICS summit and the BRICS grouping. So that is where a new section of partner nations that has been included in BRICS, right? Now, in the case of the partner nations, so that is where it talks about the outreach of the BRICS. So basically here, 13 countries have been invited to join the grouping as partner states. Latin America, in that, Cuba and Bolivia. Eurasia, from that, Belarus and Turkey. Africa, Algeria, Nigeria and Uganda. Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, and from Central Asia, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. These are the new partner states. Now, when a country becomes a partner state to, let's suppose, BRICS grouping or anything, now their eventual goal is what? To be elevated as member states. So today or tomorrow or day after tomorrow, as in the next few years, this will happen that all these countries will be elevated to a level of member state. And that will make the grouping much more inclusive. So while the Western media houses and the Western think tanks have been very quick to sideline the BRICS and to degrade the BRICS summit as a grouping of uninterested parties, the argument is it is not a worthless grouping. It is in fact a grouping which is increasing in terms of its appeal, in terms of its overall agenda. Now, what have been the outcomes for India out of this summit? Now, BRICS is one of those particular international multilateral forums that India attaches a great amount of importance to. Along with G20, G7, Quad, BIMSTEC, etc., BRICS is one of those forums and multilateral organizations that India wants to be a keen participant. So that is where India had to make its presence felt, and India did participate wholeheartedly. Now, what have been the outcomes for India? One have been the Indo-Russian relationships. The relationships with Russia. Now, this is where the visit by the Prime Minister, and that is where the warming up with the Russian state. Now, that will help and have multiple benefits to India, something that we have talked about in the previous sessions as well, be it on the defense, because still an overwhelming amount of defense equipments are being imported from Russia. So be it defense cooperation, partnership, etc. In all these areas, India is benefiting. And also when it comes to oil, Russia has been the reason why in the case where the global economy is facing a significant amount of turmoil and slowdown, India still manages to grow, keeping the inflation. Yes, the inflation rate has been high, but that inflation rate could have been much higher had the oil supply not been at a cheaper rate. So Russia has been a reliable partner for that matter. So there, India has benefited. Then when it comes to relations with China, after a long period of time, there was finally a bilateral which was held with China, and that paved the way for the final disengagement on the border, lowering of the tensions, lowering of temperature across the border, and that is good for us financially as well. Because the border dispute, while for China, it was not having that much amount of a detrimental impact, but across India, our troops were quite thinly spread when it comes to the northern borders. And then eventually, when it comes to Global South, India not only got to participate in the meetings and the members of the Global South, but also vociferously and with great amount of conviction talk about and advocate the issues of Global South associated with poverty, associated with isolation, etc. So that is where multilateralism, bilateralism, cooperation and international order, all of these can be considered to be an outcome, positive outcome for India from the Kazan summit. Okay. Now, let us take a look at the practice question. Discuss the importance of BRICS as a grouping for India by elaborating upon the BRICS spirit. Now, this is a 15-marker question. Now, how do you write the answer in this? So basically, importance of BRICS as a grouping. So in the intro, what do you write? In the intro, you talk about what is BRICS. Okay, that is what you talk about in the intro. Then after that, in the body portion, you start by talking about the fact that it is amongst the multilateral organizations that India provides great amount of importance to, along with G20, G7, where India is almost a permanent invitee of sorts in almost all the G7 meets. So G20, G7, then you have the BIMSTEC, Quad, So these are some of the multilateral organizations, SCO, that India attaches importance to. So BRICS is amongst them. That is what you start your body with. Then what is the importance for India? It gets to have the benefits associated with the global south, voicing the opinion for UN reform, then talk about the aspect of getting a consensus with regards to economic integration, people-to-people contact, an opportunity or a platform to improve bilateralism and bilateral relations to be improved, all that aspect. And India, being a responsible member of the BRICS grouping, seeks to adhere to the principles of the BRICS spirit. So what are the 8 different BRICS spirit principles? That is what you talk about. Then in the conclusion, you write that in the age of differences and global disputes, rather than unilateralism, multilateralism is the way forward or the way ahead. India and BRICS have got a very important role to play as a node for global hope, growth, and future cooperation. Like that, you can end the answer, conclude in a positive aspect. Okay? I hope this is clear. Ashwini, I hope your question regarding how BRICS came across against dollar hegemony, I hope that is clear. Now, coming to the third article, that is staying cool, but with clean tech and global collaborations. Now you see, the world is warming. The climate is changing. And that is a reality, and we have been talking about, every forum has been talking about that as well. But when we talk about cooling, cooling comes with twin issues. And let us understand that. And this is a kind of a vicious cycle also. First of all, as the temperature rises, and that is happening across the globe. This year in the summer months, India did breach in certain areas the threshold of 49-50 degrees Celsius. As the temperature rises, the requirement of cooling increases. Requirement for cooling will always increase. Now, when you carry out the process of cooling, then what happens? Let's suppose you use air conditioners, refrigerators, that is what you will use. Now, in these cases, there will be twin kind of emissions. First of all, the kind of coolants which are used, which many of the times come into the category of ozone depleting substances, or nowadays hydrofluorocarbons are used, HFCs, thanks to Montreal Protocol. HFCs are used, CFCs, HCFCs, methyl bromide, carbon tetrachloride, all of these have now been banned as per the outcomes of Montreal Protocol, which is quite a positive. But still, in coolant, you basically have the usage of HFC, isn't it? Now, this HFC has got a global warming potential. If HFCs are being used up till, let's suppose, for cooling purposes, now that alone can be responsible for raising the temperature by 0.5 degrees Celsius by 2100. 0.52 degrees Celsius to be more precise. So you can imagine that how impactful it is in terms of global warming. So when you switch on your AC, HFC is being used. That is also warming the climate, right? Then when you switch on your AC, what happens along with that? You consume electricity. Now, electricity is generated from where? From the thermal power plants predominantly. And thermal power plants, they will have their own emission of greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases will warm the atmosphere, raise the temperature again. So this is where energy requirement goes high. When the energy requirement increases, that automatically means what? That greenhouse gas emissions increase. And that means warming increases. Right? So HFC and use of coolants is also warming the planet, and the consumption of energy is also warming the climate. So as a consequence of this, what will happen? Again, the temperature will increase. As the temperature increases, more air conditioners, again these impact of raising temperature. So this is a vicious cycle that we are trapped in, that we feel the need for cooling, we use the cooling, leading to further rise in temperature, more need for cooling. But when we say the need for cooling, you have to understand what are the requirements. Why is it that we require cooling to such an extent? After all, human body is adaptable. We are capable to carry out homeostasis, which means we are able to osmoregulate and thermoregulate. Temperature and water balance in our body we are able to maintain. But still, why do we need cooling? Because when you have temperatures particularly crossing 40 degrees, 45 degrees so easily, that exposes us to a lot of vulnerabilities, be it heat waves, comorbidities, etc. Something that we have already talked about in the previous sessions also. That when you have these heat waves, the overall, during heat waves, the output reduces. There is huge amount of casualty, particularly amongst the agricultural fields across Indo-Gangetic Plains, Central India, Peninsular India. A lot of people succumb to that heat, right? Unfortunate casualties happen. Then productivity reduces. And you have to understand that in a warm and hot country like India, you also need to have cooling solutions for, let's suppose, medicines, vaccines, food. You need to keep them at cool temperature. You cannot keep them at room temperature, and the room temperature is around 35 degrees Celsius or 40 degrees Celsius, and you cannot expect the medicines to be in the perfect order. So that is where cooling is required for medicines and overall pharma sector, isn't it? Now, even the vulnerable community. When I say vulnerable community, let's suppose the old age, let's suppose the disabled, let's suppose the people having comorbidities, let's suppose the marginalized community who don't have access to resources. They are very, very vulnerable, and they are the first ones to face the brunt of climate change. So something needs to be done. So this is where what has been done and what needs to be done. If you talk about it, first of all, India recently the Prime Minister participated in the Quad Summit in US, which was hosted by Joe Biden. Now, after that, the Quad leaders came out with a Wilmington Declaration. Now, while the Wilmington Declaration talked about cooperation, talked about cyber, talked about other aspects, it also talked about developing a collaborative approach for cooling and combat against climate change. That is where Wilmington Declaration is considered to be very inclusive. You have covered all the various spheres there. Now, again, Wilmington Declaration associated with Quad Summit. Quad Summit of when? 2024. Okay. Now, here, India and US have agreed to collaborate upon newer technologies for efficient ceiling fans. There has not been any major design changes in the aspect of ceiling fans in terms of effective cooling for a very long period of time, for decades now. Despite the fact that whatever the advertisements tell you that if you switch on this fan, it will feel like Antarctica, but no technological development has happened. So efficient development of cooling solutions. High efficiency air conditioners, which are not only much more efficient in terms of cooling parameters, but also are able to provide cooling in a very short period of time, consuming very little amount of energy. So that is where India is very keen to participate in that, and that is a good news. Collaboration will bring about technological advancement, and that will bring about a better ability to combat that. Now, other than that, what have been India's actions? India has ratified the Kigali Amendment. Kigali Amendment to what? Kigali Amendment to Montreal Protocol against ozone depleting substances. Montreal Protocol in itself was signed in 1987. This deals with conservation or protection of ozone layer. So here, India has committed to reduce the HFCs, the hydrofluorocarbons, by 85% by the year 2047. Other than that, India has come out with its own India Cooling Action Plan, and that India Cooling Action Plan targets 20 to 25% reduction in cooling demand itself, right? 25 to 40% in energy consumption by efficient air conditioners, and shift to low global warming potential refrigerators. But how do you reduce the demand for cooling? In a time, in an era when the temperature is increasing, how do you reduce the demand for cooling? So that is where, how do you do that? You do that by ensuring that there are passive cooling solutions. What do we mean by passive cooling solutions? That basically means when you have, let's suppose, now this is not something mentioned in the article, when you have or when you are building a new office or a new residence, you allow for natural flow of air. The architecture of any particular city being designed should allow for natural flow so that urban heat islands don't get created. More green spaces you create so that there is shade reduction of temperature. More open spaces so there is evaporation and the natural cooling of the land. Reflective surfaces and lighter surfaces in the tropical nations to ensure that there is reduced amount of heating. So these are some of the passive cooling solutions. If that is taken up, then normally and automatically the requirement for cooling will reduce. And then with efficient systems overall, your energy consumption will also reduce. But going ahead and moving forward into the next decades, what is the way forward, particularly for developing nations, in terms of addressing the requirement of the cooling, at the same time taking care of the fact that the temperature doesn't rise up? So here, global cooperation when it comes to development of technology, right? Developed countries need to be participative because most of the countries which require large amount of cooling are situated in the range of developing or underdeveloped nations, and they are along the tropics and the lower latitudes where the heat is very high. So global cooperation, technology transfer is required. Establishing an inter-ministerial working group is something that India can do. Allocating an initial budget for cooling requirement, national capacity building initiatives, manufacturing base, research and development activities, then dedicated budget lines for cooling that needs to be promoted as well. Now, in the last conference of parties number 28, which was held in Dubai, you had the global cooling pledge, right? That aimed at reducing the emissions from the cooling sector by more than 50% in the coming years. India has not been a participant to that global cooling pledge, owing to the fact that India has got its own India Cooling Action Plan, and being a part of global cooling pledge basically means interference with its own plans. But this article argues that India has to be a part of those kind of multilateral forums and groupings also. Okay, so here, what is it that we have seen in the article? The twin issues associated with cooling in terms of emissions, the requirement of cooling, what is it that India Cooling Action Plan is about, what is the concept of passive cooling, how will you reduce the demand for cooling, and what is the way forward when it comes to India going ahead and how to approach the issue of cooling. Okay, now let us take a look at the practice question. Here, discuss the problems associated with tackling the cooling issues in the light of climate change. So here, directly, how do you introduce problems associated with tackling the cooling issues? So in the intro, you talk about the requirement that rising climate means intolerable temperatures, hence need for cooling. Okay. Now this need for cooling will provide a transition as you move into the body, and there in the body further elaborate it on the needs, heat waves, then productivity, then talk about medications, food supplies, cold chain systems, storage systems for agricultural produce, all of that you talk about. Then talk about, and that should be brief, then talk about the problems associated. What are the problems associated? So there you have to elaborate on the vicious cycle, the twin kind of emissions, and if it would have been a 15-marker question, you should have provided with the way forward as well. But it is a 10-marker. So that is where the conclusion will take a brief shape of the way forward. So in order to tackle this issue of continuous rising temperature along with the continuous rising emissions due to cooling, there needs to be a global collaboration on the lines of the Global Cooling Pledge, further enforcement of national plans like the Indian Cooling Action Plan, and understanding and innovation of newer technologies is the need of the hour to ensure planet doesn't become a hot cauldron thereby. Okay, I hope this is understood and you will be able to answer the question asked from this topic. Now then we come to another article, that is the Musi's cleanup. Now River Musi is the river draining through the city of Hyderabad. Now the government had promised, the state government had promised that River Musi in itself will be cleaned up on the lines of what you expect or what you observe in the case of London with Thames. So accordingly, a promenade will be developed, walkways will be developed, business hubs will be developed, and skyscrapers will dot the lines of River Musi, dot the boundaries of River Musi. Now, owing to that, the government has basically started clearing and demolishing structures in the entire pathway across River Musi. Now, across River Musi, you have the old city which is majorly placed, majorly situated. So as a consequence, you have economically weaker sections, old city as in there you have people living there for decades. Now, not very affluent section of the society in that part. You have workers, craftsmen, blue collar workers as they are known. They are the ones residing there. But also, not only that, not only across the banks, but even when we talk about the floodplains of River Musi, where the water is not flowing as of now, but can flood during excess rain. In that floodplain also, there has been a lot of encroachment. So there have been thousands of structures which need to be cleared. And the state government has initiated the plan to destroy those structures, clear those structures. And that has led to a lot of resentment amongst the section of population in the what is referred to as the old city, and they are very angry. There is a lot of anger against the state government associated as well. Now, River Musi, if you take a look at it, now it is significantly polluted, and you always have a kind of a unique foul stench that you associate with majority of the urban river systems in our country, be it Mithi River in the case of Mumbai, Kuam River in the case of Chennai, Yamuna in the case of Delhi. All of them have that kind of polluted nature. Now, in the case of Musi, what are the sources of pollution? Significant source is untreated sewage, right? As I told you that majority of the population living along the banks in the older city, old city as it is referred to, there the economic conditions are not that good. So that is where untreated sewage, and waste dumping is also very predominant. So that is where dumping of solid waste. But along with that, you also have industrial discharge, which happens in large amounts. Industrial discharge. Now, this industrial discharge is also quite detrimental in terms of the river quality. So very briefly, what needs to be done going ahead? So basically, the local population had talked about the fact that they were not consulted, whereas the government had said that we had consulted with the local population, we had given them the option to shift to a newer place, but they did not agree. Now the local population again says that we will not shift. So the entire project should be scrapped. Now this offers a kind of a dilemma. an absolute dilemma, that whether if you don't allow for the shifting of the population, how will you clean up the entire region? You talk about the Singapore and the Londons of the world, but then all of them had required a large amount of rehabilitation of the local population into different areas so that the river system can be clean, be it Singapore, be it London, be it Spain, anywhere. Now, that is where what can be the way forward. So basically, first of all, one of the major issues that the state governments face or the local governments face in terms of the rehabilitation activities is many of the times the population doesn't have land records, that they are living there for, and that is legal, and it is not an illegal settlement, so they don't have the land records. Now, as a consequence, there is nothing stopping them from demolishing those structures. And the people say that we have been living there for 50 years, 60 years, etc. But legally, that is not correct. So that is why clear, transparent and digital land records, digitization of land records should be done by the local governments as urgently as possible. This will also help galvanize the municipal revenues, and that will help in better rejuvenation of the urban locality as well. Then tackling the source of pollution is the need of the hour, be it untreated sewage, be it dumping of the municipal waste. Unless and until you do that, regardless of how many structures you demolish, the river will continue to be polluted. We have seen that in the case of Delhi. Ensuring the floodplains are no development zones, point blank, right? Regardless of whosoever wants to settle in the floodplains, you should not allow them to settle. Why? Because these floodplains are the natural absorbers of the life cycle of the river. If you destroy the floodplains, then river slowly and steadily stifles into suffocation and the flow, ecological flow of the river stops. So that is where these no development zones should be maintained. Local population as stakeholders in terms of determining what the future of the city should look like. And that is very much important. And unless and until you do that, local population will always feel as an outsider, and oftentimes they will not cooperate. And what is also required is, we need certain flagship projects across the country for rehabilitation and rebuilding. For example, there have been very bad experiences whenever people have been rehabilitated or relocated from a particular area. So that is why people naturally have a kind of a hesitation when it comes to the aspect of relocation. So we need certain flagship cases in urban environment, be it, let's suppose, slum rehabilitation. What is happening in the case of Dharavi? Now, Dharavi as a slum, that has remained in news for more than the time that I can remember. Right, that has been in news since the early 90s that Dharavi will be redeveloped. Largest slum is not a kind of a price tag that you want. But then there is always some or the other dispute. So let that be an example. Create a kind of a multi-storied structure there so that the slum gets converted into clearer space, so that people from other parts can also take a look at it and they wish the same for themselves. Nobody wants to live in unhygienic conditions. So that is something, let's suppose Hyderabad municipality itself takes that as a project, that Musi river front, that will have this kind of a rehabilitation scheme. Show them to the local population, gain their trust. Only then, otherwise, why are you developing the riverfront for? Who are you developing the riverfront for? If the local population is unhappy, that means there is no purpose. So that is the problem faced by almost all the urban river systems across the country. And this is the way forward that you can write, where UPSC is known to be repeating questions associated with urban rivers and the calamities. Now coming to certain topics relevant for your prelims. Now, after the Bandhavgarh Tiger Reserve death, MP forest officials and the departments are considering using satellite collars to track the wild elephants. Now, because large group of the herd, now all of them, they perished, they died. So that is where population of elephants need to be conserved. So radio collaring is being sought to be done. Now, radio collaring is not something which is new for elephants. It is already being done in Tamil Nadu, Assam, West Bengal, and in certain instances in Karnataka also, but very few. So that is being done. Also at the same time, the wildlife officials are monitoring the elephants and trying to take them and keep them away from the kodo millet. Right. So the kodo millet is the one which is known for and which has been attributed as the reason for the death of the elephants after all. So very briefly, what is kodo millet? So it is known as cow grass or rice grass, cultivated and consumed widely by the local population, the tribal population in central India and Deccan Plateau. It is known to have significant amount of advantages for health, but this kodo millet also is prone to fungal infections. And that fungal infection, when it happens, after that, if it is consumed, it can release cytotoxins and that can have detrimental impact, which has killed the elephants. Okay, so radio collaring is important. The location of Bandhavgarh, that is something we have covered in this week's Places in News. So do take a look at that in the eastern part of Madhya Pradesh. Then the aspect of kodo millet. What is it? And it is responsible for the deaths. Okay. Now, after that, Chief Justice Chandrachud completes last working day in office. Now, that marks the end of one of the very public and high-profile tenure of the Chief Justice, with a lot of media glare on each and every one of his moves over the past few months. Finally, that marks the end of the tenure. The new Chief Justice is going to be Justice Sanjeev Khanna, and he is going to be the new Chief Justice of India, and he is being appointed. He has already been appointed by the President as per the provisions of which article? Article 124. Article 124(2) of the Indian Constitution. That is the provision by which the new Chief Justice gets appointed. Okay, Chief Justice had a kind of a momentous day and yesterday where he talked about the aspect of the media pressure, social scrutiny, etc. Okay, but that is not something relevant. Article 124 clause 2 is something which is relevant. Then Zomato, Swiggy breached antitrust laws, right? The Competition Commission of India probe has indicated. What is antitrust laws? So basically these apps and these platforms, aggregator platforms, they have been known, or the investigation was carried out by the Competition Commission some time back, was initiated, and finally Reuters has reported that CCI has found that they have breached these antitrust norms. So what is it that they have done? Zomato and Swiggy have been known to provide a preferential treatment to certain restaurants and certain outlets, offered them a kind of a lower commission or operated at a lower commission, and just to promote them. Now that has got the tendency and the perspective of distorting the market competition. Because let's suppose you have two restaurants, one of them enters into deal with Swiggy or Zomato, then this restaurant will always be given a preference in terms of when you open the platform, when you open the app, when you order, there will be multiple different pop-ups, etc. So naturally the behavior is inclined towards that restaurant. And also let's suppose this restaurant has partnered with Zomato, and Zomato has said that I will charge lesser commission fee from you. So what will happen? This person will be able to offer their products at a lower price. When they are able to offer at a lower price point, it will be more lucrative, and that will be damaging the true sense of competition in the market and distorting the market. So CCI is expected to take some action against these aggregator platforms as well. Okay. Now, this was initiated in 2022, by the way. Now, after this, tea industry, the last topic, tea industry calls for scientific quality grading. So when it comes to tea is of many varieties, many different types. Now this tea, the tea industry has said that let's go for a kind of a grading and branding of the tea based upon one leaf, two leaves, multi-leaf, so that the consumers are able to differentiate that what is the difference in terms of quality for various different products, so that they are able to make informed choices. Only then will they be able to understand, and that will also create demand for higher grade tea and will put newer entrants into the market, will open the market for the newer entrants at the same time. So that is something to boost the demand, to increase the transparency, and also ensure consumer awareness happens on a larger scale. Okay? That brings us to the end of the discussion for today. Satyam, what is comorbidity? Let's suppose you are suffering from any other illness which will also impact you as per the or along with the heat waves. That is comorbidity, when you are carrying another illness as well. Ashwini. So Ashwini, I hope your dollar hegemony question is understood. And regarding the statutory body, are you asking about CCI? So yes. Okay. Sandhyalata, tea board or tea or coffee related quality, these are in which part of the paper? This is in the business page for the international edition. Okay. Right. The PDF, the annotations will be available to you, Purvi. Don't worry. So now I do advise you to visit the Telegram page, take a look at the multiple choice questions and attempt the answer. I hope the session has helped you understand the nuances of certain complex topics like the 1967 Supreme Court judgment. Those are important. The BRICS, the aspect of cooling action plan, those are important for your exam. If you have liked the content, put that in the comment section and don't forget to click on the like, share and the subscribe button. Till we meet again, do take care. Goodbye. Thank you.